Thank you, Ms Webber. I now call on Graham Day to be followed by Pam Duncan-Glancy again for around 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Earlier this month, during the debate on Programme for Government, Liz Smith made some legitimate points about the expectation of the public that both of Scotland's governments would work together to address the cost of living crisis. Now, I could, I think, reasonably observe that in order to work together, the relationship requires to be respectful and one of equals, and that the conduct of the UK Government towards their Scottish counterparts and the comments from the new Prime Minister directed at the First Minister have hardly engendered that. But let's leave that to one side, because Liz Smith, as a long-serving and respected member of this institution, was right in what she asserted. There are, however, other similar expectations from the public. In fact, I would argue expectations we as MSPs ought to have of ourselves. And as an MSP of less long-standing than Liz Smith, but one who served here for more than a decade, I want to focus in the context of this debate on what I would argue is one of those. Presiding Officer, the oft-heard cry in this place is that it is the role of Parliament to hold the Government to account, and it is. But I say, particularly to Stephen Kerr, how the institution sets about that task is every bit as important. Just returning to the backbenches earlier this year, I have been pleased to serve on the Parliament's Education Committee. It has, under the convenership of his successor, Sue Webber, been a pleasure, not least of all because of the approach that has been fostered and taken by members, a genuine cross-party endeavour to interrogate fairly the condition of our education system in a balanced way, giving credit where it's due and offering criticism where and when it's merited. The recent unanimously agreed report into the attainment gap was evidence of that. I would contend that the Parliament would benefit from seeing that approach being replicated here in the Chamber, where regrettably too often oppositional politics tend to come to the point where they overwhelm reaching measured and balanced conclusions. Too often in this place our debate, especially around topics such as education, descends into a government awful versus government good contest, when the truth and reality lies somewhere in between. The Scottish Government isn't perfect, and yes, sometimes we on this benches need to acknowledge that. But nor is it anything like as deserving of the nature of the criticism that pours down on it sometimes from opposition benches. And in treating subjects like education as a political football, we not only let down those seeking the best from it, the parents, the pupils, the professionals, we also sometimes ignore or downplay the actual causes of shortcomings, or at least contributory factors to these. And that does nothing to achieve the goals I think collectively we all hold. There is much to celebrate in our education system, despite it being sideswiped by the pandemic. And I want to highlight briefly one or two aspects of that as they relate to my Angus South constituency. The significant strides made in partnership with the SNP Scottish Government and Angus Council to improve our schools estate. The progress made, again jointly, in delivering a transformational early years and childcare offering. And congratulations are due to the teaching staff and the pupils of Montefieth and Webster's High Schools, along with Arbroath Academy, whose 21-22 exam results performance represented a significant step forward. But equally, within education, locally and nationally, there remains areas for improvement, as the Cabinet Secretary has acknowledged. Presiding Officer, in the course of participating in the Education Committee's inquiry into progress in the attainment challenge, I was struck not only by the passion of the teachers we met in West Central Scotland for the task at hand, but their willingness to innovate and learn from mistakes. More recently, in the course of the inquiry into the impact of college regionalisation, which the committee is conducting, I had a wry smile at hearing from college representatives of the benefits from merger and regionalisation. Oh, how I remember the reaction of the college establishment when the idea of merger and regionalisation was advanced by Michael Russell. Let's just say it was Arctic in its warmth. Now, I highlight these particular examples to illustrate the importance of, on the one hand, listening to those at the coalface and then rolling out best practice, whilst also recognising that sometimes you have to implement change because it's the right thing to do, regardless of possible resistance to it from vested interests. And that brings me to the second subject I wanted to focus on in my contribution, and that's the change to come that others have highlighted. Most specifically, implementing the recommendations of Ken Muir's report. The Education Committee's recent session with the leadership of the SQA threw up an interesting exchange around the shaping of reform, or more accurately, the replacement of the body. We explored the concern on the part of some that what is being embarked upon will produce actually only a rebranding, as others have noted. As Michael Mara highlighted at the session, the fact that of the 11-strong delivery board, 6 are employees of the SQA will only heighten those concerns, whether they are justified or not. Now, of course, as I said earlier, having coalface input is important. If nothing else, it can potentially identify problematic unintended consequences of change. And I'm in no doubt whatsoever as to the intent of the Government and this Cabinet Secretary in this regard. But when the SQA Chief Executive, Fiona Robertson, tells the committee that she does not accept that the decision to replace it is indicative of a conclusion that being reached that it has failed, then you've got to understand the concern. Because if the SQA don't think they're being replaced because they got things wrong, then how can we be certain, with such a significant in-house presence on the board, that the recommendations which will come forward recognise the need for genuine change in the way that Ken Muir and the Cabinet Secretary, by their comments and actions, have indicated is required? So, in conclusion, I wonder if, during her closing remarks, the Cabinet Secretary might provide some reassurance around exactly how she's going to ensure that the modus operandi of the new awarding body, which has been accepted, must change, how it will undergo the transformation that's being sought. And I do so, sadly, holding the view, after listening to Mr Kerr's contribution, and to a lesser extent that of Willie Rennie, that there's a far greater chance of that than my earlier plea being heeded. But call me naive, I live in hope, Presiding Officer.